Greetings and thanks to all of you for joining. This is our third in a series of Living in the Age of COVID-19. I'm really pleased to have Dr. Brilliant back with us today. He was last with us in September when he spoke extensively about the views of the development of some of the new vaccines and also what we were learning about the spread of the virus. But since he's been here, my goodness, what an enormous amount has happened. We now have vaccines that have been approved and indeed are in the process of rolling out. We also have a wide selection of new vaccines which have not yet been approved but are in various stages of their trials. At the same time, the virus has been incredibly active. We've had some of the worst spikes around the world around the holiday period. We've also had the emergence of a series of mutations, which have unfortunately also taken the name of countries, which is not that helpful. But in any event, it does show that the viruses can change and morph, and that this COVID virus is not different from others that we've had. And so we find ourselves here in February in an absolute race, a race between the spread of the virus and the spread of vaccines. And against that backdrop, we have the difficult logistics of getting the vaccines in people's arms. We have still a good number of people around the world who are quite resistant to vaccines in general, and it seems this one in particular. And we have, at the same time, an enormous number of people who feel that they simply need to get back to work, back to play, and back to the way that they want it to be. So it's a great time to reflect, to look at the progress we've made, and to ask a true expert how he's handicapping this race between the vaccines and the viruses. Based on her outstanding role as interviewer last time, I'm very happy that our own Debra Netschert is back to interview Dr. Brilliant. Debra, as you know, is the senior portfolio manager on our health sciences investment team at Jennison, which is one of the best known in the industry. And so, Debra, a warm welcome to you. And Dr. Brilliant, it's wonderful to have you again. Thanks to both of you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm thrilled to be back with Dr. Brilliant, who, if you remember, is an epidemiologist, physician, and author. He also is well known for his work with the World Health Organization and helping to eradicate smallpox. He's chairman of Ending Pandemics Advisory Board and has been a leader at various organizations that address the pandemic, climate change, and water security. He's also been named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people and has received many honorary doctorates. So welcome, Dr. Brilliant. Right before we start, we wanted to actually do a polling question for everyone on the line. So I have been vaccinated. I'll get a vaccine when I'm eligible. I'm not comfortable getting a vaccine, or I prefer not to answer. So if everyone could just answer the polling question, we can see what kind of audience we're dealing with. So 87.2% of people are going to get the vaccine. 7.7% have been vaccinated. I'm jealous of all of you. 2.6% are not comfortable getting a vaccine, and an equal number of people don't prefer to answer. How does that number compare to the 7.7% of people vaccinated? Do you remember how that compares to where we are on a national basis?
I think it's probably just about right. Because it didn't distinguish one or two doses. Perhaps that might account for the difference.
Right. So I'd love to start the next part of our discussion just by asking you some questions about, where we are and where we're going. And as David Hunt appropriately pointed out, a lot has happened even in the short time between the last time we were sitting here talking. And so I'd love to just start a little bit with testing. So there's been a lot of articles in the papers recently suggesting that thanks to under testing, we probably are at a higher percent of herd immunity than the data suggests. So I'd love to understand from you, your thoughts on the rate of testing. And then also, I know you have some really interesting things to say about herd immunity.
Well, thank you, Deborah. And I want to reflect on what David said as the introduction. This is our third time getting together. And I think the last couple of times we sort of got it right. It was easier, I think, to see where the virus was going to go. He characterized this moment as a horse race to be handicapped. And I think he's right about that, too. We have some real challenges ahead of us, and the crystal ball may not be as clear this time because of the variants. But as far as testing goes, we have in the United States systematically under-tested. We underestimated the disease the first few months when it arose for the first time from Wuhan. And every month, really, we either didn't have the technology, didn't have the tests, didn't have the willingness to test. So I think if you add all that up cumulatively, the people that you are quoting are absolutely right. There's a higher percentage of people who have had the disease, particularly asymptomatics. And I think the ratio that CDC and others are now estimating, anywhere between 3 and 5 times more people have actually been exposed to and have had even a mild case of COVID than we report in our numbers. And I think that is probably in large part because we've underestimated the test. So I think you're exactly right.
And then what about herd immunity? We're going to get into the variants a little bit, after this, but actually maybe we'll save that because I think they're probably intertwined. So what do you think about where testing is going and what the world of testing is going to look like over the next 12 months, right? I mean, there's a lot of, you're seeing a lot of things in the news. I think Walgreens actually just launched an over-the-counter test from LabCorp yesterday. You're seeing a lot of different tests that are going to essentially be hitting store shelves. And so how should we as consumers start to think about these tests and when we should be testing and how we should be testing, and should we be having COVID tests in our medicine cabinets now? Or, what are your views on how important testing is going to be over the next 12 months?
I think as consumers, as parents and investors, we should be focusing more on testing. Especially in the travel industry, in the live entertainment industry, people who have indoor restaurants and schools. I work a lot with Hollywood. We're able to maintain a production set in Hollywood with no transmission at all on the set. It's one of the safest places in the world during the pandemic because of testing. But I think what makes us feel more normal, what lets us feel comfortable getting on an airplane with 300 strangers, is a 5-minute, $5, accurate test that you take at home with saliva, self-administered, perhaps with a camera to make certain that it's really you and your saliva. And being able to do that and feel really comfortable with the results every morning or every 3 times a week, I think that will make us feel more normal. The vaccines, the therapeutics, they will actually make us get healthier, get us back on the road to normality. But what will make us feel more normal is being able to go back to the things that we love, whether it's opening up our offices or enjoying some of the entertainment that we all do and travel. That will not happen just because of the vaccines or the vaccine certificates or immunity passport. Testing is really in the next 6-month period going to be critical. And I think the good news is the technology is moving in that direction, as you cite. I don't think we're more than 3 to 5 months away from an ideal type of test that we can do at home. Take it ourselves with saliva, no more of these brain ticklers with long swabs.
That's welcome news. I mean, just to make you laugh, this morning, my children have to take a COVID test once a week, and they got the COVID test sent home yesterday, and we were walking to school, and I was like, oh no, we didn't do the COVID tests. And I was like, open your backpack. So we opened their backpacks, and we're walking to school just doing their saliva test. So it's possible. It's very easy. We completed 3 COVID tests safely on the sidewalk. So. Yeah. But when is it that you think we're going to be able to, is it realistic that we're going to be able to do this in an economic way, right? Because I know right now the costs for the school that my children attend to run these weekly samples is astronomical, right? So it's not realistic that that Americans are going to be buying $150 COVID tests off the counter at Walgreens, right?
That's right. And it is $150 for a PCR test that is the gold standard, that is the most efficient, and it's the most effective and most trusted. But we now have portable, rapid PCR tests. They're as accurate as the ones you send off to a lab, but they're $300. It's going in the wrong direction. There are a lot of CRISPR-based tests, LAMP-based tests, lateral flow tests that are trying to become small enough and inexpensive enough that they can break through that economic barrier that we have. I will say there's 2 tests being done, worked on at different universities, MIT and UCSF, that are based on CRISPR technology. That's aiming to be a $6 test, a 10-minute test, and it's really interesting. It bathes the virus in a way that creates phospholuminescence, which is read with your cell phone, and then you get a quantitative score as well as a qualitative score. I'm really excited about the next 3 months of testing. I think as an industry and as a technology, but much more important, as a way to get back to school, to get back to the office, to get back to normality.
Yeah. So why don't we turn to the variants? I mean, the New York Times today talked about the New York variant, and you and I before this, you were jokingly saying that New York just always wants to keep up with California, so they had to have their own variant. But we are seeing a lot of different variants start to pop up, and so why don't you talk to us a little bit about how we should be thinking about that? How concerned should we be about these variants? Are these variants starting to take on some of the worst characteristics of all of the viruses, and how should we really be thinking about the variants as they evolve?
Yes, they are taking on some of the worst characteristics, and I think you nailed it. There's a process called convergent evolution, where you can have multiple viruses in different parts of the world all mutating at the same time, and they converge on a certain set of mutations in different variants that are good for the virus. And let me explain what I mean by that. We've had over 110 million known cases of COVID. As we mentioned earlier, probably there's 3 to 5 times more number of cases, really. So 500 million people have had the disease. Every one of them have had tens or hundreds of billions of viruses in them. If you multiply 500 million times tens or hundreds of billions, you get a number much larger than a Google. And every one of those viruses wants to replicate. That's the job of a virus, is to replicate. Right. And as it replicates, a certain percent of those replications go badly because it's an RNA virus, a single strand, not like a DNA virus, which has 2 strands where the other strand acts as a spell checker or an editor. So you get more mutations. So you get replications, then mutations. The vast majority of these mutations are not good for the virus. Some of them give the virus an advantage of speed in that horse race. They become variants, and when they also have a transmissibility advantage that makes them set apart, we call them variants of concerns, VOCs. Those are the ones we're worried about. There's at least 6 to 12 of them, and they are really of concern.
So what does that mean for herd immunity? How does that change the equation and how we need to think about achieving herd immunity?
Yeah, it changes the equation completely. I don't think we will ever reach classical quantitative mathematical herd immunity now. The equation that you're talking about is that to get to herd immunity, you have to have immunized, combination of vaccinated and have had the disease, a number greater than 1 minus 1 divided by R naught. That R, we've talked about in the past, the measure of transmissibility. So as transmissibility increases, then the number of people, the percent of people who have to be vaccinated increases, but that number is actually an exponent. So it increases more dramatically. And I think in the beginning of the outbreak, we may have thought that we could get by with 2/3 of the population being vaccinated, then 3/4, then 7/8. We're well over 90% of the American population. And when we talk about the world as a whole, it's even more difficult. we're not going to get 90% of Americans vaccinated. If you just think about the people who are immunocompromised, can't be vaccinated, young children, too young to be vaccinated, vaccine resistors, people who take one dose and quit, new migrations into the country, we'll never get 90%, I don't think. But it shouldn't matter. We'll get the effect that we want. I try to tell people Big Ben is not going to strike 12 when you get to herd immunity and there'll be flowers and rainbows. But the closer you get to vaccinating most of the people, the less room the virus has, and it can't reproduce. The case counts go down dramatically. If we add on to that mass vaccination, outbreak containment, if we beef up testing, tracing, and isolation and include testing, tracing, and immunization, and really go heavy on that contact tracing, we'll be able to get by just fine. But honest to God, it's a race. If every time we get a new variant, the vaccine manufacturers have got to create a new booster, the race becomes not so much between humans and the virus, but within the vaccine manufacturing community. How fast can you get a booster out? I want to just say today's vaccines clobber today's variants, but tomorrow's vaccines are going to have to clobber today's variants plus all the new variants that come out. And that's where I'm worried. And Deborah, I'm most worried about the rest of the world. We're talking about how soon will we get to 70, 80% vaccine coverage in the United States. For 100 countries at least, they don't have the money, the ability, the relationship with WHO or COVAX to even get enough vaccine for 25% of people. And yet they will continue to get sick, get COVID, and produce variants that will go all over the world. So this race is more difficult than one that we faced up until now.
So why don't I want to come back to that, but why don't we spend a little bit of time on the vaccines? And there's obviously been a tremendous amount. The last time we spoke, we hadn't had any of the data from any of the vaccines, and now we have data from multiple different vaccine players and lots of details on the vaccines. So why don't we just get your thoughts on the current slate of vaccines? Obviously, there's different kinds, there's different manufacturers, there's different numbers of doses that need. And so how do you think about the progress we've made? I guess maybe we start with the pros. Let's talk about the things that have gone right.
Yeah, we often say that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Never has that been more true than it has been in vaccine technology. I worked in the smallpox program. We had a vaccine for almost 200 years before we had a global campaign. Polio, we had a vaccine for 70 years before we had a polio eradication program. The idea that you can go from the day the virus jumped into humans to a global vaccination program in 1 year and have the number of people vaccinated as it is today, twice as many as the number of cases that have been recorded, that's magic. Remember, we're going to be telling our children and our grandchildren that we were here the year of the vaccine. That being said, we're having some difficulty rolling that vaccine out. I think things are changing now. I think yesterday we passed 2 million doses in a single day in the United States. The rest of the world, as I mentioned earlier, is morally and epidemiologically, and I think selfishly, a grave concern. I'm particularly interested in the mRNA vaccines. And the reason is it's a brand new technology. One day it may be available to use to combat diabetes, other non-communicable diseases, certainly other infectious diseases. But the reason it's so valuable right now is that the time from idea to delivery of vaccine is so short. And you see that that's the reason that the mRNA vaccines were the first to market. They will be the first to market also with booster shots that deal with the then current variants. So I would bet on that technology. It's not a company that I want to bet on or a vaccine, but that technology remains really amazing.
What about the ability for that vaccine, just when you think about mass vaccinations, just in terms of the freezing requirements and the ability for that vaccine to really get to the masses, so to speak?
Well, when they were first launched, the manufacturers thought it had to be kept in minus 100 degrees, and no longer is that the case. For both Moderna and Pfizer, they're now able to store it at refrigeration, regular refrigerator coldness, temperature. Still, it's awkward to have 2 vaccinations instead of 1. It's awkward to have a cold chain at all if you're thinking about working in Zimbabwe or in Libya or any other part of the world that doesn't have the infrastructure that we have in the West. So it has those limitations for sure, but it has this great advantage of being able to create a booster. It wouldn't surprise me if we have a booster for some of the mRNA vaccines before Labor Day.
Yeah. And how important, so when you think about people getting vaccinated and getting their first vaccine now with all of these variants, I mean, do you worry, are people going to start to feel that it's not worth getting vaccinated if the variant strains? I mean, how close are we? And when you think about the vaccines, how close are we in terms of the variants coming on board and the vaccines being effective? And maybe when you think about that, what part of the data do you look at for the vaccines to deem them effective?
I think we're burdening people with forcing them to become vaccinologists, armchair vaccinologists. And it's a hard thing, but we have to be very careful in our communications and radically transparent. The vaccines of today clobber the variants of today. The difficulty is that the creation of variants is a little bit like a motion picture. It just keeps on going and going. And whenever you cut off, because at some point you've got to say, okay, print. You've got to say, let's go to market with the vaccine we have. There will always be variants right after you go to market with the vaccine that you have that will handle the variants up till that moment. Then what do you do about the new variants? Well, there'll be a period of time before the next booster. Is that a liability? It will be until the vaccine manufacturers figure out a way to target the part of the virus which is not mutating as much. Right now, we're focused on the spike of the virus because we have this kind of image of a key and a lock. The spike is the key and the hole in the lock is the ACE2 receptor. But there's another part of the virus that's not involved in that, and so it doesn't mutate as much. We're learning that the boosters that will be coming out will target other parts of the virus, more stable parts of the virus. And if so, those vaccines will handle today's variants and tomorrow's variants much better. So I'm optimistic about the vaccine, and I'm optimistic about vaccine science.
And so when you think about, I mean, I think one of the data points when you look at all the various vaccinations, and in my opinion, is really just is whether or not the vaccine's able to decrease severe disease and hospitalizations, right? This is a manageable virus as long as we don't have people requiring hospitalization and we actually, can control the death rate, right? So when you look at the data today, I'm actually really positive on all of the data that we've seen across all of the vaccines. I mean, if you look at, obviously there's a big article on the J&J data this morning in the New York Times talking about, because they had their AdCom with the FDA yesterday. And so do you look at that and think about that? How do you view controlling the severe form versus controlling all forms?
I'll just tell you personally, the best vaccine to take is the one that you're offered first. Like the best camera is the one you have with you. They're all great at doing exactly what you say. In fact, I don't think we've had a single death as of today. We should date and timestamp this. A single death from anyone who was completely vaccinated with Moderna or Pfizer. And likewise, all the vaccines prevent ICU admission and death. And they do it really, really well. And that is in part because that was the goalpost that was created by the FDA in order to give these emergency use authorizations, a good and a bad. That's the most important thing to target. But what they didn't do is say that you had to target making a vaccine that stopped people from spreading the virus or from getting a mild case. And since these vaccines have not been tested, the protocols, have not been applied. We don't know whether the vaccines actually stop transmission. Obviously, we think that they do, but we don't have the data for that. And we don't know if they stop you being infected. Obviously, we think that they do, but those are open questions right now.
So how should we all think about this, like putting all this together, right? If you think about this is the first time that anyone has had to deal with vaccines that were developed so quickly, vaccines that were developed by a new technology that, as you said, has never been used before, and then also kind of vaccines that have gone through emergency use authorization, and so you put those together, and it's and a lot of it's asking Americans to be part of a clinical trial in a way. And so when you look at the efficacy and the safety of these vaccines, I mean, how do you give everyone comfort on this call when you look at these, you've done a tremendous amount of work looking at all of these vaccines and all of these different diseases. So with the data that you're seeing for the vaccines today, how confident are you on the efficacy? How confident are you on the safety? How confident are you yourself in taking a vaccine in one of these vaccines?
I have taken 2 doses of one of the mRNA vaccines because that's what was offered to me. I would have taken any of them. That's how confident I feel about them. If you look at the death rate in the United States, we've just unfortunately, sadly, poignantly, unbelievably passed 500,000 people dying of COVID. If we didn't have the vaccines, I would be telling you that I'd expect that the death rate would go over 2 million by the end of next year. That's the trajectory of the disease absent the vaccines. With the vaccines, it is a horse race. We are fighting against the variants, but at least we've got a shot at ending the major knock-on effect of COVID, which is the huge number of deaths and hospitalizations. I don't think, as I said earlier, we'll get to herd immunity, but I do think we will get to a point where we can live with the endemic disease of COVID. I am worried about the fact that COVID now is shown to affect perhaps a dozen different animal species, which gives rise to the fear of a reservoir constantly coming back. I'm very worried about 100 countries that will not be able to be vaccinated the way we are in the next 3 or 4 years, and disease ping-ponging back and forth. But I'm not worried about the vaccines that we currently have and the ones that are soon to be released.
What about the rollout of the vaccines? It hasn't been perfect. It's been tough a lot of, I kind of was likening it to, I was telling my kids that the vaccine rollout reminded me of when I was a teenager and concert tickets used to go on sale and you had to call Ticketmaster and it would be busy and they didn't even know what a busy signal was. But I explained that to them. And so, when you think about the rollout, when are we going to get more vaccines? When is the rollout going to be easier? How do you envision that someone like me is going to be able to get a vaccine easily? I mean, most of the people on this call probably are similar to me, and they might not hit the age brackets. They might not have comorbidities. And so how is it that someone like me is going to be able to get the vaccine easily?
Yeah, how would it have been if you'd gone to Ticketmaster or wherever to get those movie tickets for your kids, and Ticketmaster said, well, we've only got tickets for people who are left-handed and under 4 foot tall and have one blue and one gray eye. That's the way vaccine distribution was even 2 months ago. That's the way it was set up. It was really difficult. I will tell you that yesterday CDC launched or supported an app called Vaccine Finder. There's another app called Dr. B coming out of Columbia University that matches people who want to get a vaccine with providers of vaccination to be able to find unused or last minute vaccines that's available.
Let's just stop for a minute, just so the people on here can write these down and maybe use this information effectively. So Vaccine Finder is by the CDC. It's something that people can...
CDC supported. It's come out of Boston, come out of Harvard. Dr. B is coming out of Columbia. And each of these apps, and there'll be a dozen more by the time we finish this talk, are trying to match people who are searching for a vaccination with your CVS or your Walgreens or your hospital system or your public health system that is currently offering vaccine, and for which age groups and which demographics, and which ones have extra vaccine. So, for example, last week, because of the freeze in Texas and throughout the middle part of the United States, the supply chain got interrupted, and we didn't get the deliveries last week that we needed. This week, I expect that we'll get 2 or 3 times the deliveries to make it up. And there may be, for a moment, a little bit of a surplus. So you should, you should watch carefully what's available in your neighborhood for you. But I do think that this is a short-term problem. Seeing the number of vaccinations, not vaccines, but vaccinations, go up from 500,000 to 1 million to 1.5 million to 2 million, going on to 3 million a day, and seeing the supply of vaccine that's being delivered makes me very optimistic that come April or May, more people will be able to get vaccine. And I think certainly by the summer, anyone in the United States who wants to get vaccinated can be vaccinated. I am, again, worried about the rest of the world. I think the UK is doing fine. Israel, obviously, is a leader. We're going to have winners and losers. And you and I are used to talking about winners and losers about companies. There will be winners and losers of companies, winners and losers of industries. There will also be winners and losers of countries. And as we said in the very first of these sessions, whoever wins the war of COVID wins the future. And that's true for countries. It's also true for companies.
So what happens if we do get to the point at which we have a surplus of vaccines over the summer or towards the end of the summer? I mean, I think the thing that I fear the most is that we have a huge vaccine rollout. It's going really well. In the US, we're getting vaccinated and we're fine, as you said, but that there's these vials of unused vaccines that just get wasted and they're on US soil and can't be shipped internationally to other countries that need them. And I mean, is that a realistic concern? And is there a way are people thinking about ways to make sure that this doesn't happen I can't imagine throwing away vaccines. It would just kill me, right?
Yeah, no. That's a great question and a great observation. So this group called COVAX with 1X, which is a consortium of WHO, Gavi, which is the Global Vaccine Initiative that Seth Berkley runs, and CEPI, which is a organization that mostly philanthropists and other organizations to create vaccines, those and the Gates Foundation and other groups put together COVAX. The idea being that wealthy people, foundations, bilateral donors would put money into COVAX, which would allow them to buy vaccines, which would then be distributed 2 billion doses free to countries that couldn't afford it. Just recently, COVAX has agreed to take as donations, not just money, but excess vaccine. So we'll now be able to do exactly what you said. When we have a surplus, which let's cross fingers, we will have a surplus, hopefully, we can donate vaccine and other developed countries, because it's not fair that 60% of the vaccine manufacturing capacity for the next year was pre-purchased by a handful of countries. It's not in our best interest that our population gets vaccinated and we have extra vaccine in our refrigerators, and elsewhere in the world, people can't get vaccinated. That's not ethical, it's not moral. But as a selfish point of view, that means more cases, more variants being developed elsewhere in the world and coming back here. So this new way of donating vaccine to COVAX, I think, will really help us.
And what about children? So how should we be thinking about returning to school? How should we think about kids getting vaccinated? Do children need to be vaccinated before they can return to school? What are your thoughts on children and vaccinations for them and all of the above?
Yeah, I think going back to school has been one of the toughest issues we faced as a society. We want our kids back in school. We know that virtual education is not the same thing as in-school education, but we want it to be safe, and we're just we're worried. I think the gating issue for getting kids back to school is less vaccinating than testing. Let's go back to the earlier conversation. If we really have a $5, 5-minute saliva-based test, kids love to spit, a spit test that can be done before you brush your teeth and go to school. If we have that, and we have it for kids and teachers and the custodial staff and all the parents who are going to come to pick up and drop off their kids, then that vibrant organization that we think of as a junior high school or a high school or a grade school, that can be made safe by excluding not people, but the virus. We've shown that we can do this in any number of settings now. Just think about the NBA's bubble. Think about the Seattle Seahawks, alone among all NFL teams, not a single case of COVID. And think of Hollywood. We can do everything in schools that we do in those elite, rich communities, but we can only do it if the cost and the ubiquity of those tests come down and become available. That's going to be the most important thing. Do the kids have to be vaccinated? I think eventually it'll be like the flu vaccine. There'll be a special version for kids. Just as in flu, there's flu mist, so kids can take a dose of it without having an injection. I think there'll be some specialized form of the vaccine for kids. But right now, I would focus on the testing in large part because testing will work on variants, and also masks, social distancing, hygiene, they're going to work on all the variants. We haven't lost any of those tools.
Yeah. So when you think about testing and you think about, this is return to work, return to school. We'll stick to schools first. I think work might be a little bit different, but if we think about the schools and we think about the kids, we're in September now, right? Kids are not going to be vaccinated come September because I don't think we're going to have the data in children by then, right? So what is the frequency at which, number one, what is the likelihood that we have these $5 tests that can actually be self-administered easily and quickly? Number two, what is the frequency at which? So if you were opening public schools tomorrow and you were put in charge, what would be the protocol? What would it look like? Would they be wearing masks? Would they not be wearing masks? Shoot me forward to September 2021 and give me a crystal ball of what you think it can look like and maybe what it will look like.
So my organization, Pan Defense Advisors, works with schools. We work with companies trying to figure out back to work plans. We work with industries, and we've helped to make political conventions safe. I mentioned Hollywood, company reopenings. We work with a lot of very different organizations. We have the technology today to make schools safe. It's just too expensive. We don't need to have some technological breakthrough. We need to have the advantage of the market, which through creating scale is able to drive the costs down. You're focused on September. I do think by September, we will have point of care at-home diagnostic tests that are affordable, maybe not $10 yet, but under $20. And they will be available in sufficient quantities so that schools will be able to depend upon them to be dependably available for an entire school year, which is really important, and to be able to open. I really do think.
How many times a week do they need to be testing? Once? Like they test on Friday and they can come back on Monday, or?
No, I don't think we're going to get to that. I think in Hollywood, we test 3 times a week, 5 times a week in many of the locations. At the political conventions, we tested every single day. There is a trade-off between the accuracy of some of these tests that are low cost with the frequency that you have to test. I don't see it being once a week. I do see it multiple times a week. I've worked with camps during the summertime last year, and we were able to keep them safe, but only by testing 3 or 4 times a week.
Okay. How about back to work? So obviously, everyone is trying to figure out when is the right time to start getting people back to work. How should we really be thinking about what the back to work looks like? When is it that we can get back to work in a way where we can actually collaborate? We can sit in the same room, we can sit in a conference room, we can actually have in-person meetings and things like that. How do you envision the back to work in is the staggered fashion the way that we're starting to talk about? Is that the right way?
Yeah. Deborah, I think even those colleagues that you hated when you were working right next to them, don't you miss them right now? We all want to go back to work. We want to go back to a regular life. I think it's heavily dependent on the industry that you're in. The technology industry, engineers can work from home. Most of the customer service people can work from home. There's not that urgency in the tech industry. So most tech companies have just notified their employees they're not going to open again in this year. They won't open until 2022. I think the travel agency is on the other end of the spectrum. They're on pins and needles hoping they ever open again and are desperate to get the kind of testing that I've talked about. Even they're looking at immunity passports, which have they're controversial because they can be fabricated. WHO has taken a position against them. But when you're talking about a regular mom and pop office, we will be able to start getting back to work. I think we're going to have a pretty good summer. And I think we'll begin to see people going back to work. If it's a regular office on Main Street, I'm not so sure that we'll all feel comfortable yet going into a crowded, dim-lit bar and rubbing elbows with people we don't know, or indoor dining, until we're really able to have a diagnostic test that makes us know the immune status of the people that we're next to. I think the financial services community has done just fine working from home. Many people report that it's been better, and that's going to be an issue going forward on the real estate market. Of all the success at work from home is what's going to happen to the commercial real estate market. But I think it's so industry specific, it's difficult to be more precise than that.
And I mean, what about travel, right? How should we think about international travel, right? If we go back to what you were saying about the difference between different countries being vaccinated, how is that going to affect our ability to do business internationally, to be going back to traveling internationally, be going back to traveling for vacation and things like that?
So my advisory group works with Hawaii and tries to help figure out how to keep the island safe while they are gradually readmitting tourists. In doing that, we have to deal with the airports, the airplanes, the arrival at airports, the hotels, and the cadence for testing. And I think in most places, people try to get 2 tests done before you get on an airplane. In reality, it's frequently only 1. And 1 test on arrival, followed up a few days later, usually 4 days, by another test on arrival. This is complicated, but it's going to take something like that to make people feel that they are comfortable getting into an airplane again. If you think about it, it's a hermetically sealed metal cylinder with 200 or 300 people whose vaccine, virus, immunity status you don't know. So we're going to have to double down on making people feel safe, or only urgent travel is going to populate the skies. Hotels are beginning to feel that they're getting a little bit more comfortable opening up with some degree of opening, always depending on what the jurisdiction has set down as the requirements. Again, I think we might get a good summer. I do harbor this concern that with case counts coming down 60%, 70% in some jurisdictions, I don't want us to have irrational exuberance and immediately think summer is going to be normal. If we overdo it in Memorial Day and 4th of July in the United States, we have the possibility of facing a Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's that's as bad as last year. So we've got to be very careful. Our behavior today will influence our freedom or our feeling of normalcy tomorrow.
Okay, so we are going to take a break from me asking you questions like this, and we are going to go to the lightning round of questions. So true or false, you can contract COVID-19 from a vaccine?
You cannot contract COVID-19 from today's vaccines. You can contract the disease from a vaccine, but not from these vaccines.
Great. Okay, next question. True or false? Vaccines prevent the development of disease, but do not treat the disease.
That's correct.
Great. True or false? You can be a COVID-19 carrier after you receive a vaccine.
So here there's a difference between can be and are. You can be a COVID-19 carrier after you receive a vaccine. We don't think you will be, but we don't have the data yet. And this goes back to the conversation that we had before. Not a simple true or false answer. The FDA did not require testing of the vaccines that have been approved to see whether they interrupt transmission. I'd put an asterisk on that.
Okay. All right. True or false? People who have recovered from COVID-19 don't need to get the vaccine.
False. But I do think it's one dose, not two. I think somebody who has had COVID effectively has had the immunological equivalent of the first of the two doses of the vaccine and would do well to take one dose, but they wouldn't need two.
So do you recommend them not getting their second?
I recommend them getting the first and watching the data that is coming out every day. The world changes, but I think that will be more than sufficient based on all the science that we've seen. Getting one dose if you've already had COVID will stimulate the immune system more than sufficiently.
Does that matter whether or not you've had a severe case of COVID or a non-severe case?
We don't know. We don't know. We have the data that we have. We have so little data on people who have asymptomatic cases or light cases. The data that we have is only from cases that have been reported.
So when you say that, though, that you think they might only need one, does that include the asymptomatic people?
It has to, because we don't know that they were asymptomatic by definition.
Right. Okay. Okay.
If you haven't been diagnosed with COVID, you certainly should get both doses.
You can carry the virus for 14 days before showing any symptoms.
That's right. The incubation period of the disease can be 2 to 14 days. Now, that doesn't mean that it's normal to be 14 days out. The average is probably 5, 6, or 7 days out before you show symptoms. But you can carry it 14 days. That's correct.
True or false? Temperature monitoring is an effective way to test for COVID.
Another one. I have to weasel a little bit. Temperature monitoring for you as an individual is, of course, a very effective way to know whether you are sick at all and whether you might have COVID or the symptoms of COVID. But it's a lousy way to test for COVID on a countrywide basis at airports as a gating issue to go into your workplace. And the reason that it's lousy isn't that you won't find people who are incubating COVID, it's that you'll also find people who are incubating colds, incubating flu, women who at a certain part of their menstrual cycle have an elevation of temperature, people who have an infected toenail who might. So you're going to wind up getting dozens of people caught in the temperature surveillance system. You're not going to find too many with COVID. It's not good for that, but of course it is for you as an individual.
What are we going to do and how are we going to deal with the mental health of the workforce and of Americans and of global citizens in general as we come out of this?
Isn't this the biggest silent epidemic of our lifetimes? Doesn't everybody have COVID brain or PTSD? Yeah. It's really been an awful, difficult, challenging time for the people who are least affected, let alone those who've had to bury a loved one or had to go to a nursing home and put their hands on a window and watch a mother or grandmother that they couldn't touch and come close to. This has been a really hard time. We're almost going to have to redefine the terms of mental illness. There's hardly any of us that are going to get out of this year unscathed in some way. Right. If we're honest, we talk to each other, I think you find if you start asking people how they really feel, this is a deep set and ubiquitous issue. So if the question is how do we deal with it, number one, with love and kindness. And there's this great quote from Goethe, be kind to everybody that you meet, for each is fighting a great and noble, courageous, heroic battle. You just don't know what their battle is. And I think as a society, we have to start talking about it openly and finding a way to deal with it as an illness and as a natural condition of being in the middle of a pandemic.
Okay, we have a bunch of questions, so we're gonna go a little faster on these. You mentioned the mRNAs. One of the audience members is asking whether or not, since it's a new technology, we should be concerned about the long-term side effects.
I'm not concerned about it. I do know a physician, an orthopedic surgeon, who said that he would never take an mRNA vaccine because he didn't want somebody else's DNA in him. And I said, what? There is no somebody else's DNA in an mRNA vaccine. So it's usual, I think, in every new technology, especially a new technology you're going to put into your body, to be concerned about long-term effects, especially when you've only had the vaccine for months and nobody has had more than 3 months experience with these vaccines. It's a normal thing to worry about. I worry a heck of a lot more about getting COVID than I do about the vaccine. And the way that the mRNA vaccines work, they're a little bit more like a computer code in a packet of viral fat that's injected. There's no living virus in it. There's no fragment of a virus. It just doesn't have much in it that you could say again?
I said it's a recipe.
It is. It's a set of codes that you're telling your own cells. You're giving your cells coded instructions on how to make immunity to the virus. So I'm actually less worried about them than I am about any of the attenuated viral vaccines that one of the Chinese vaccines has that kind of a characteristic. So I'm more worried about that than I am about the mRNA vaccines. But it is new. Okay. It's not unreasonable.
Yeah. One last question, real quick, is at what age can kids get vaccinated right now?
Yeah, that is a fiercely fought over issue. We know that at over 18, but there's obviously people trying to push that number down, and there's a lot of science going on right now to help us adjudicate that.
Okay, we are going to go to another polling question. When do you anticipate a return to greater normalcy for yourself and your family? 2Q21, Q321, Q421, 1Q22, or beyond? Dr. Brilliant, when do you anticipate normalcy while we wait?
Well, I'm an epidemiologist in the middle of a pandemic. This feels like normal to me.
So it looks like we got the polling results. When do we all anticipate a return to greater normalcy for yourself and your family? It looks like 50% of us think that it's going to be Q1 22 or beyond. And then there's some 4% of us are really optimistic that are looking forward to a return to normalcy in the spring. I love the optimism, but I would say that I'm more in the with the 49% in 22 and beyond. Okay, well, we are just about out of time. So why don't you give us your 3 takeaways that you really want us to remember coming out of this conversation?
Well, thank you. And thanks again for inviting me back a third time, and for David's introductory remarks, and especially for working with you again, Deborah.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
It's really been a pleasure. So when David said there's a horse race and asked us to handicap that horse race, this is not a race that you want to have a photo finish. You don't want the virus to win by a nose. But in order to defeat the virus and its variants, we need to remember there are things that work against all variants: hand washing, face mask wearing, social distancing, testing, tracing, and isolation. These things work against all variants. We haven't given up any of our tools, no matter how frightening or concerning it is. The second thing is mass vaccination. The way in which we are vaccinating as many people as possible has tons of benefits. An equity lens have tons of important moral considerations and benefits. But it is something that is important, necessary, but not sufficient to conquer the virus. We're going to have to get to outbreak containment. We're going to have to work in communities that have resisted vaccination with radical transparency and honesty. We're going to have to work worldwide. If there's one thing to take away, it's this notion that it's not just the 1960s kumbaya to say we're all in it together. There's probably never been a greater convergence of the moral need to work with people all over the world, as well as the selfish reason to work all over the world. We need to re-empower WHO, refund all of these global agencies that will help us, because we can't ourselves go and work in other parts of the world, but we really need to conquer this virus on a global basis. And the last takeaway I would say is it's what your mom and your dad taught you when you're growing up. Patience, kindness, trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes. Debra asked us about mental illness, depression. This has really been a tough time. And if somebody tells you that they've sailed through it, they're not being honest with themselves. Be kind to everybody you meet, for each is fighting a great and noble and heroic battle that you may not know about. And with that, thank you so much again for inviting me back.
Dr. Brilliant, thank you so much for your time again. It has been a real pleasure to get to know you. And I think everyone on this webcast, including myself, has learned so much from you over these. And I really look forward to staying in touch in the future and hopefully doing one more of these over the summer so we can keep up on hopefully how we're improving from here. Thank you so much.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.